Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this Tech Talk today, and welcome. No worries if you are just joining a minute late. I think we'll get started in just a second. Okay. Okay, and yeah, we'll also keep this interactive. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat as we go, and we'll also have time for Q&A at the end. Today we will be talking about establishments, vendorship from address support, and registration ID governance on invoices in Dynamics 365 ERP. This is a core capability introduced in 10.048 release, designed to help customers comply with increasingly strict invoice identification on invoicing requirements across different countries. I will be walking you through the business problem, the solution we've built in the product, and two demos showing both setup and invoice posting scenarios. Before we open the floor, I'm happy to introduce my colleague Evgeny, who is helping us to moderate the Q&A today during the presentation. And as a quick note, we'll share a short survey in the chat. Please take a minute to participate, as your feedback helps us to improve the product. Well, my name is Elizaveta Golub. I'm a principal product manager working on Dynamics 365 Finance, specifically in globalization and regulatory space. My focus areas include regulatory reporting, electronic reporting, and multi-country compliance solutions. Well, in many countries today, companies operate multiple physical locations under the same legal entity. Regulators increasingly require invoices to identify not only the legal entity, but also the specific establishment or branch involved in the invoice transaction. Every country does this slightly differently. In France, establishments are identified using SIRET. In Belgium, a branch ID is required. In Thailand, invoices must include a tax branch code. In some countries, these requirements are now enforced digitally through e-invoicing platforms, which means invoices that do not contain correct establishment information or registration IDs may be rejected. To address this challenge, we introduced the establishment concept in Dynamics 365 ERP. The model operates at three levels: the legal entity, which holds enterprise-level registration IDs; establishments, represented by operating units that correspond to physical sites; and customer and vendor establishments, because trading partners also operate multiple locations. The key point is that this model is country agnostic. France is one of the examples that I will be using in today's demos. The same structure applies globally. From regulatory perspective, invoices must clearly identify both the issuing and receiving parties, including their respective establishments. For outgoing invoices, this includes your legal entity, your issuing establishment, the customer legal entity, and the customer delivery establishment. For incoming invoices, the same applies in reverse, including the vendorship from establishment. And France is a great example of where this is becoming mandatory at scale. To solve this end-to-end, we introduced two new features in feature management. The first is establishment and registration IDs governance on invoices, which provides automatic determination, validation, and immutable storage of registration IDs across all invoice flows. The second is the vendor ship from address support on invoices, which allows vendor establishments to be explicitly identified and stored. Both features ship as a part of Dynamics 365 ERP 2026 Release Wave 1, aligned with the regulatory timeline for the French B2B mandate. Please note this timeline that is provided on this slide reflects the current plan for the feature release, and it is subject to change based on the results of the preview phase and ongoing feedback. A key design principle here was predictable defaulting. The system determines your company establishment using a clear priority. First, the site-based defaulting. If a site is specified on a transaction and linked to an establishment, the system uses that. Second, if no site is available, it derives the establishment from financial dimension value, such as, for example, a business unit value linked to operating unit. And finally, if neither applies, the user can select the establishment manually. At posting time, the establishment is validated and stored immutably on the invoice. Customer establishment is identified using the delivery address on that invoice, while the vendor establishment is identified using the ship from address. This distinction is important because it makes establishment identification intuitive and consistent with how business actually operates. The new vendor ship from capability ensures that vendor invoices can now meet the same regulatory standards as the customer invoices. Behind the scenes, all of this is driven by newly introduced invoice party applicability rules. Registration types define what the identifier is, for example, VAT ID or CRAN or CRAT for France. Registration categories in their turn extended with these applicability rules defined for which invoice party role and on which address this registration type must be defined and immutably stored on invoice posting. At posting time, the system follows a clear flow. It resolves the establishment, evaluates all applicable rules effective on the invoice date, validates that required registration IDs exist, and then stores everything immutably on the posted document. This gives you a complete audit trail and prepares the invoice for invoicing or reporting. With that foundation in place, let's move into the demos. The first demo walks through the setup flow, showing how these features are configured end-to-end using finance for France as an example.
In this demo, I'll walk you through the new establishments and registration ID governance capabilities, using demo data from the company FRSI, a French legal entity. These enhancements are part of the 10.0.48 release of Dynamics 365 ERP, and the demo data is provided out of the box to help you clearly understand how these features are configured and used in practice. We begin by enabling the two required features: Establishments and Registration IDs, Governance on Invoices, and Vendorship from Address Support. Each feature includes a quick link to the official documentation, which is already published and available directly from Feature Management. Once the features are enabled, we move on to setting up registration categories and their invoice party applicability rules. When opening a registration category, you'll notice a new Invoice Party Applicability button on the action pane. This button is enabled for VAT ID, Enterprise ID, Branch ID, and SIRET registration categories. For France-specific scenarios, we configure applicability rules for 3 registration types. In this example, we configure the SIREN, which is used for the enterprise number, the VAT ID, which is used for the company's VAT ID. These 2 registration categories are used in France to record registration numbers of the head company for legal entities, customers, and vendors. For this reason, they can be set up either on the primary address of the relevant party or on an address that is explicitly marked with the head company address purpose. This is useful in scenarios where the primary address does not represent the actual head company of that party in France. With this setup, the system first attempts to retrieve registration IDs associated with an address that has the head company purpose. If none are found, it then falls back to the registration IDs defined on the primary address. SIRET registration category identifies the establishments in France. For the SIRET, we set up the customer and vendor roles associated with the invoice address purposes, in addition to the primary address role. This enables the system to identify the registration IDs specified for customer and vendor addresses, representing both their establishment on invoice via delivery or ship from address, and also for their head company. For SIRET of the head company for customers and vendors, we also set up primary or head company purpose. These categories form the foundation for how registration IDs are selected and applied on invoices. Once the registration categories and applicability rules are configured, we review the registration IDs assigned to the legal entity. For the FRSI legal entity and its primary address, the following registration IDs are defined: VAT ID, SIREN, and SIRET. It's important to ensure that the effective from dates are set correctly, because these dates are used by the invoice party applicability logic and directly affect which registration ID is selected on an invoice date. After completing legal entity registration IDs, we move on to establishments, which are created using operating units. The first establishment is the head office of FRSI. For its primary address, only the SIRET number is required, as this is the key establishment level identifier in France. In addition, 2 more establishments are created for operational locations. These are also created as business units in this example, and for each one, the appropriate establishment number is specified. With this, all establishment level registration IDs are in place in our example. Next, we ensure that all operating units representing establishments are included in the correct organization hierarchy. And associated with the new hierarchy purpose introduced by this feature, which is the enterprise establishment structure. This association is essential, because only operating units linked to a hierarchy with this purpose become available for use on invoices. To support automatic defaulting on invoices, establishments are then associated with inventory sites. In this example, the head office site is linked to the head office establishment, while the operations back office and regional consulting office sites are linked to their respective establishments. Because the establishments were created as business units, they are already connected to financial dimension values. This allows the system to automatically determine the correct establishment on an invoice, based on either the site or a financial dimension value. With the establishment setup completed, we now ensure that registration IDs are correctly configured for counterparties so that they are available to be immutably stored on invoices. For customers, this means reviewing all customer addresses and ensuring that required registration IDs are defined. For France, each customer must have, at a minimum, a VAT ID, SIREN, and SIRET. If a customer has multiple addresses representing different establishments, and those addresses are used on different invoices, the address must be assigned the invoice purpose and the appropriate establishment level registration ID must be defined for that address. The same validation is performed for vendors. All vendor addresses must have the required registration IDs, including a VAT ID. If a vendor has multiple ship from locations representing different establishments, each address must include the establishment level registration ID and must be assigned the invoice purpose. In addition, on the vendor master record, the require ship from on vendor invoice option must be enabled if you want the ship from address to be explicitly captured and used on invoices. Finally, once registration IDs are set up across legal entities, establishments, customers, and vendors, the last step is to enable the corresponding parameters in each module. The same set of parameters is available in accounts receivable for customer invoices, accounts payable for vendor invoices, and project management and accounting for project invoices. With these parameters enabled, establishments and registration IDs are consistently determined and stored for all supported invoice types. This completes the configuration flow. Thank you for watching this demo.
Okay, what you have just seen is the full setup journey from feature enablement all the way to transaction-ready master data. The important takeaway is that this is a structured process. Once it's set up, all invoice flows automatically benefit from the same governance logic. Now, let's look at how this works at runtime when invoices are actually created and posted across different modules. The second demo shows how these capabilities work during invoice posting across accounts receivable, accounts payable, and project management and accounting.
As we've just seen, the system is now fully configured to support registration IDs, establishments, and also vendor ship from address. All necessary setup has been completed so that registration IDs can be automatically identified for legal entities, its establishments, customers, and vendors based on invoice party applicability rules. In this part of the demo, we'll walk through a few concrete examples to see how customer and vendor invoices can be posted using this new functionality. We'll start with a customer invoice, using a free text invoice as an example. When we create a new free text invoice and select a customer account, we immediately notice a new field on the invoice header, the establishment field. This field becomes available when the require establishment on customer invoice parameter is enabled in accounts receivable parameters. Once this parameter is turned on, the establishment field can be used either manually or automatically. In our example, it is automatically derived based on financial dimensions. As you may recall from the setup demo, we configured 3 establishments in the system and selected each of them to a business unit financial dimension value. To see this in action, we select the business unit 253, which represents the regional consulting office. Based on this single financial dimension value selection, the system automatically determines and populates the corresponding establishment for the invoice. For this example, we also changed the delivery address to Site Bordeaux. We now proceed with the free text invoice and enter the remaining details, such as the main account, sales tax group, and unit price. At this point, we can review the registration IDs that have been identified for this invoice. For this purpose, a new Registration IDs button is available on the Action pane. This button is enabled for free text invoices and sales orders when the require registration IDs on customer invoice parameter is turned on in accounts receivable parameters. When we select this button, a new form opens showing all registration IDs identified for the invoice. These values are determined based on the invoice party applicability rules and the registration IDs configured for all parties involved in the transaction. For this invoice, we can see the SIRET registration ID that represents the establishment, which in this case is the Regional Consulting Office. We can also see the VAT ID, SIREN, and SIRET registration IDs for the legal entity. In addition, the customer registration IDs are shown, including both the customer establishment registration ID derived from the delivery address and the registration IDs associated with the customer head company that are set up for the primary address of that customer record. All three registration types are identified and presented clearly in the preview. Once this information has been reviewed and validated, we can proceed with posting the invoice. After posting, we can open the corresponding customer invoice journal record. From there, we can use another Registration IDs button available on the action pane to review the registration IDs stored for the posted invoice. These registration IDs are now permanently and immutably stored, ensuring full traceability and compliance for this transaction. With the customer invoice completed, we can now look at vendor invoices. Similar functionality is available in accounts payable. In this example, we create a new pending vendor invoice. After selecting the vendor invoice account, we immediately see Ship From Address field at the header level. It is available because the Require Ship From On Vendor Invoice option was enabled for this vendor during setup. The value is automatically derived based on the vendor addresses and address purposes defined on the vendor master record. As with customer invoices, we can also rely on financial dimensions for automatic establishment, defaulting and pending vendor invoice lines. In this case, we select the business unit 254, which represents the operations back office. This automatically sets the establishment for the pending vendor invoice. We then proceed to create invoice lines. For the first line, we select an item, for example, a tablet item. For item-based transactions, a site is automatically defaulted. If we change the site to the Regional Consulting Office site, the system immediately updates the establishment on the line to match the establishment associated with that site. The ship from address is also synchronized accordingly, using the value derived from the invoice header. For another example, we add a procurement category line, such as rent. In this case, no site is involved, since this represents a service rather than a stocked item. As a result, the establishment cannot be derived from a site. Instead, the system automatically determines the establishment based on the financial dimension selected on the invoice header. This ensures consistent and predictable behavior across different transaction types. Before posting the vendor invoice, we can review the registration IDs identified for each invoice line. For vendor invoices, the registration IDs preview is available at the line level rather than on the action pane. It can be accessed through the Financials inquiry options for the pending vendor invoice lines. By navigating between the lines, we can see the registration IDs determined for each line individually, reflecting the differences between item-based and service-based transactions. Once everything has been reviewed, we post the vendor invoice. After posting, the registration IDs are stored immutably for the vendor invoice, just as they were for the customer invoice. These values can be reviewed from the posted invoice, providing full transparency and auditability. Registration IDs of the vendor invoice header level, such as legal entity and vendor head company, can be reviewed on the Overview tab, and the line level, such as companies and vendorship, from establishments from the Lines tab. The same establishment and registration ID functionality is also available for project invoices, when project invoice proposals and customer intercompany project invoices are used, ensuring consistent behavior across modules. This concludes the demo of how the new establishments and registration ID governance capabilities are applied during the posting of customer, vendor, and project invoices across Dynamics 365 ERP.
Okay. To summarize, establishments and registration IDs governance, it's a country-agnostic core capability designed so that any jurisdiction can configure its own registration schemes and rules. It provides an unified approach across accounts receivable, accounts payable, general journal, sales, purchasing, and project management and accounting. One setup, all invoice path. And that brings us to the end of the presentation.
Yes, Elizaveta, we have a couple of questions currently open. The first one is, we haven't seen even how the selection of our establishment can be automated on the FTI. So can you please comment how this can be automated for free text invoices?
Yeah, for the free text invoices, the inventory level defaulting is not available because obviously we just don't have any site in the free text invoice. And this is where the financial dimension level is leveraged. So whenever you have your financial dimensions connected to those operating units that are representing the establishment, and in terms of the finance functionality, this means that those operation units are included into that organization hierarchy, which is assigned with that specific new purpose that is introduced with this feature. So when those operating units are connected to any level of the financial dimension, and that financial dimension value is used in your free text invoice, establishment will be automatically defaulted for your free text invoice. I hope this clarifies.
Thank you. One more question is about suffix and service codes for France, and the same as for engagement number for B2G invoices, I believe also for France. Do we support this functionality for these types of registration IDs and codes?
I'm not quite sure about all the registration types that exist in France. But with these registration types and registration category functionality, you can create as many different combinations as you need. But the registration categories is a limited list of the values that is predefined and exist in the system as the enum. Currently, we enable the invoice party applicability rules only for 4 of those existing values. They are the VAT ID, branch ID, SIRET, which is French specific, and also the enterprise ID. So there are 4 registration categories for which you can set up invoice party applicability rules. What this means for your invoices? This means that for these 4 categories, the system will be able to validate those registration IDs and store them immutably on the invoice level. But you can still use all the other registration categories that are either exist in the system, or you can also extend that list with some custom value. Those things would be not stored for your invoice, but they still can be used and set up for your customers, vendors, establishments, and also legal entity. The difference would be that they will remain as the master data on the level of those customers, vendors, and establishments. They won't get stored for your invoices. I hope this clarifies your question.
Okay, we are over time. Maybe just one last question.
Okay.
Is how this will be integrated with electronic reporting, especially with e-invoicing?
Yes, that's a good question. And basically, this is what is going to happen for the both electronic invoicing and electronic reporting functionality for France. We are going to leverage the new data sources where the registration IDs are stored per the invoices as the main data sources for e-invoicing and e-reporting. And specifically, the SIRET, SIREN, and VAT ID are expected to be set up using the invoice party applicability rules and thus stored on the invoice level. Thank you, Evgeny, for presenting the questions. If there are more questions coming, don't hesitate to send them out to us in using the Viva communities. I have put some of the links of those communities on this slide. And thank you so much for joining today's Tech Talk. And yeah, just feel free to reach out through the usual channels in Viva communities. And also, please take a couple minutes to fill in that survey that we have shared. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.